Now we're going to use the Sencha Architect to create a web application that accesses the Webspeed web services we previously created. We're going to choose to create new button, and Sencha gives us a number of choices. We're going to use the EXTJS 5 framework, and as you can see, it has some example layouts, some example applications you can start with, and some basic layouts to start with. We're going to start from a blank project. When Architect starts up, we see we have a design canvas, a toolbar on the left with all the widgets and objects we can drop onto the screen, a project inspector on the right where we can see some non-visual objects as well as get to the code behind the scenes, and an area where we can see the properties of the currently selected object. To get started, we need to set some of the project settings. First, we don't want to use the built-in web server. As I mentioned before, we use IIS, so I'm going to point to my local IIS, localhost. The publish path. When you publish from Sencha, it's going to push out the application to whatever directory you want. If you can reach your web server, you can publish it directly to the web server. So I'm going to go to my computer, inetpub, www root, and I'm going to put it in a subdirectory called doctors rather than put it in a root, which is actually going to cause some issues later that we'll have to address. In the framework, we see that we have the option of build tools. We're going to disable the build tools, which means we're going to be using the entire EXTJS framework for our application to run. Sencha does provide a set of build tools where it will analyze your application and deploy with the app just the portions of the framework that you need in order for the application to run. When the entire EXTJS framework loads, on a good connection, it's almost meaningless. It only takes a couple seconds. But if you really want the application to load its fastest, we'll want to enable the build tools and let Sencha deploy just the portion we need. So we'll save our settings and then save the entire project. The save path is the root save path. We're going to give this a project name of Manage Doctors. You could leave it My App, but I'm going to change the application name to Doctors. And you can see it below in the light green. It says the project will be saved in C, Web Projects, Manage Doctors, with the name of Manage Doctors XDS. To get started, we're going to drag a viewport out into our design canvas. You can either go to the right section, which would be containers, and scroll through it and find the viewport, or as a shortcut, you are able to type ahead at the top and get right to the widget. So I'm going to drag and drop it. As you can see on all of the objects, you're able to hover over the little question mark and get a little bit of help. So this describes a viewport as a specialized container representing the viewable area, in parentheses, the browse viewport. So it's basically a frame that's going to expand and contract with the browser so that objects inside of it can move and expand and contract. Next, I'm going to add a panel to the screen, which reminds me a lot of a progress frame. So I'm just going to type panel, drop at the top, and just like a progress frame, it has a header which we can hide or not hide, and we'll be able to drop other objects into the panel. Next, we'll put 3 buttons on this panel. 1 button, 2. As you can see, the buttons are automatically sizing and going from a left to right pattern in this panel. I'm going to set some attributes on these buttons before we continue. So on the first button, I'm going to come over to the properties where you can scroll through all the properties that can be set on it. I'm going to type ID to jump ahead. I'm going to give this a ID of button load. I can also set its text property. Instead of my button, we're going to call it load. Do something similar on the next one. We'll jump to the ID property. We'll call this one button server filter. And notice I missed a case. It is case sensitive for later if we try to access it by its ID. And Sencha actually has some shortcuts. Up here on the button, I can double click on it and call this one server filter. Do it right on the screen. Next button, we'll do the same thing. This is going to be our fail. And over here, we'll give it an ID of button fail. Next, we want to access the Webspeed web services and display the JSON that's returned on the screen. The first thing we're going to do is add what's called a model. A model is an object that's going to represent any type of persistable data. In this case, it's going to look just like a temp table. We're going to give it a name, we're going to give it a set of fields, and when the data comes in, it's going to be able to allow us to access the data and display it on the screen. So to add a model, we come up to our project inspector, press the little plus button, and choose at this point model. We now have a model added under models. We're going to have to set some of its properties. Let's give it an ID of model doctor. And we'll add the fields to it that match the serialized names of the temp tables in our Progress Developer Studio application that we created. So first I'm going to find the fields property, add, and over here we see our temp table definition. We see we want to add doctor ID, doctor, and actor name. So doctor ID, doctor, actor name. We also have series type, bio, start year, and end year. Series type, bio, start year, and end year. We can view the code that's being generated behind the model by clicking on the code button and highlighting model doctor over in our project inspector. And we can see it's pretty straightforward. You can see the fields being defined for a model named model doctor. Next, we're going to add the JSON store to the project. The store loads the data using an AJAX proxy and also has functions within the framework for sorting and filtering and querying the model. So we'll come up to our project inspector. Now we're going to add a store. This is going to be a JSON store. As you can see under stores, a new store has been added. Going to change its name to store doctors. We're going to tell it which model to use. We're able to select it from a list of defined models. Next, we're going to give it a URL to access the data in design time. So we'll go on to the AJAX proxy, come down to the URL attribute. And of course, this URL is going to point to our development server. So this URL is not something that's going to be, we want to be hard-coded forever. We don't want it to use this URL during our testing or during our live. So let's just take the URL that we created to get to our web service, paste it in. Now that we have a URL at design time, we can right-click on the store, tell it to load data by clicking on the little, what kind of looks like an eyeball icon. We see that it calls the web service, and we can actually take a look at the data. Now let's add a data grid so we can display this data in a meaningful way. Go back to the design, and we need a grid panel, which is under grids. And because I don't like to scroll, I'm going to type grid and drag and drop the grid panel onto the viewport. So as you can see, the panels go from top to bottom on a viewport by default, which you can obviously change. Within a panel, the buttons went left to right, and now we have a grid panel on the screen. I'm going to select the grid panel, and for the demo, I'm going to give it a height of about 350 by dragging it rather than typing in 350. Come over to its properties, and we'll give it an ID grid doctor. Next, we want to link this data grid to the store. You see the little gear icon up on the grid? It's a shortcut to get to certain features that you're going to use on every grid. In this case, we want to auto scroll. We're going to choose the doctor's store. And another nifty, handy dandy feature, if we right click on the grid panel, we can say auto columns. It went to the store, pulled in the data, and actually displays it on the screen. Very handy in design mode to be able to see the data as it's going to be displayed. In fact, we already have a bug. The doctor ID is not being displayed. To troubleshoot this, I'm going to go back to my store, look at the data again, and I see doctor ID, case sensitive with a lowercase d. So I've already determined what my problem is. Go back to the model, go back to the model's fields, and doctor ID will come down. I'm going to change its name to doctor ID. Whoops, missed. You see behind the scenes, the code has been changed. Going back to the grid, my viewport, the grid. I can either now go to the field and correct it, or I can reload my fields again. But I'm going to choose to correct it. And as you can see, Doctor ID already got corrected. It knew because it's linked to that model to fix it. So I'll just change its display for now to match. Save my project. And I'm going to reload the store so we can see it in design time. And we fixed it. So now we have a nice ugly grid trying to display the information. There's little shortcuts that you'll find, such as if I wanted to change the displayed column title, you can double click on it here, change that just to actor, which as you saw, this changes just the display, not the linked data index. All right, I'm going to save my project again, and let's deploy what we have. Not that there's much yet. So in my IIS root under doctors, we have nothing yet. Come back to architect and click the publish button. We see it deployed a small application. So now I'll go to my web browser and open up that index HTML that was deployed. And we see a nice ugly grid with a bunch of buttons that do nothing and no data in the grid. So now we'll have to write the code that loads the data from the store and refreshes the grid.